Hello everyone and welcome to today's market briefing hosted by AEMO Services. My name's Deborah Palmer and I'm facilitating today's briefing. This is the first of a series of market briefings to help proponents bid successfully for LTESs and access rights. You can go to the next slide, please. I'd like to acknowledge that today we meet on many Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging through thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. Thank you. If we can go to the next slide. So in terms of the agenda for today's briefing, I'm going to introduce you to the team. Then we're going to be covering off the market briefings, keeping in touch in the lead up to the Tender 1. We'll be talking about accelerating through the roadmap, Tender 1 happening in Q4 of this year. Then we'll be looking at the LTESa design and the LDS eligibility, what's the latest and what's coming next. And then I've got a panel discussion with the panel following up from the tender design webinar and some key questions that arose during that webinar and following afterwards as well. And then we'll be finalising the session with what you can expect from us in the coming months. So with me today from AEMO Services is Baharak Shabadakara, who's the Co-General Manager of Commercial, Melanie Coroner, who's the General Manager of Systems Planning and Renewable Energy Zones, Brad Hopkins, who's the Co-General Manager of Commercial, Graham Eadie, who's the General Manager of Financial Markets and Operations, and Thomas Ubert, who's the General Manager of Stakeholder Relations. It's great to have the whole team here today. Thank you. If we can go to the next slide. I'd now like to hand over to Baharak, who will be talking us through the market briefing series and how to keep in touch in the lead up to Q4 2022 tender. Thanks, Baharak.
Thanks, Deb, for that introduction. And so in my session, I'm going to talk about what the market can expect from us in the next few months. So these market briefings are part of our commitment to stakeholder engagement and customer-centric tender design and delivery. And we plan monthly briefings using a variety of tools, including written briefing notes on particular topics, recorded briefings, and hopefully transitioning to podcasts, interactive online or in-person sessions, and where appropriate, presenting at existing market forums on particular topics and providing information and answering questions. So the briefings will be focused on progressively providing information to help project developers make decisions about their projects and prepare their bids to participate in the competitive tender, particularly in the first tender in Q4 this year. And these briefings and this information delivery will be culminated in the release of our tender program guidelines, which will be the go-to place for all project developers about everything they need to do in order to participate in the tender. Throughout these briefings, we'll be looking to cover how the merit criteria are assessed through the tender process, and providing insights to what good looks like. We'll be looking to provide information about the outstanding merit test, and outstanding merit, as many of the market participants would know, is under the Electricity Infrastructure Act. Projects that are outside of the geographic boundaries of a renewable energy zone must demonstrate outstanding merit, and we'll share with you or with the market how AEMO Services will assess that. We will work through access schemes, particularly the Central West Orana access scheme and the access rights, and how they will be treated in the competitive tender process. And we will look to provide information on how AEMO Services will assess value to consumers from the bids. We welcome feedback on the briefings, both on the usefulness and the quality of the briefings and the information that's delivered, but also feedback on what topics would be useful for us to focus on or include into the program. We'll aim to publish a schedule of upcoming market briefings over the next couple of weeks on our website. And at the end of this session, we'll provide the focus of the next market briefing. And I think I'll leave it there, Deb, for now, and hand over to you so we can delve into the topics for this market briefing.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Baharak. I'd now like to introduce you to Melanie Corner, who's the General Manager of System Planning and Renewable Energy Zones. And Melanie is going to be talking about how we're accelerating the roadmap for the Q4 2022 tender. Thanks, Melanie.
Great, thank you, Deb. So back in December of 2021, we published our Infrastructure Investment Objectives Report, and that set out our development pathway, which established a target and a tender plan for how we intend to run tenders for LTESs over the coming 10 years. That report indicated that we'll be running tenders every 6 months. The actual volume that we award in any given tender will depend on the assessment process, which will consider the eligibility of the project and the proponent, non-price merit on criteria such as community shared benefits, regional economic development, and impact to the grid, as well as a price assessment for financial value. So the actual volume will depend on whether we receive high quality value bids through that project. When proponents are choosing which tender they may want to participate in, they may want to consider the relationship between access scheme declarations are made for the individual RESs. So projects that are seeking both an LTESA and an access right may choose to wait until both the relevant RES and the access scheme have been declared by the Minister before they participate in any given competitive tender round. So in April this year, we released an announcement saying we were updating the tender schedule and accelerating the roadmap through a Q4 2022 tender. So we decided to increase the volume that we intend to target in our first Q4 tender to 2,500 gigawatt hours per annum of new generation, and as well for that Q4 2022 tender to target 600 megawatts of long duration storage. Those targets, the 2,500 gigawatts and 600 megawatts, are decoupled from the quantum of access rights that are available and is not a constraint on how many access rights could be allocated in any one tender round. For the Q4 tender, we're welcoming participation from projects across New South Wales for long-term energy service agreements, including those outside of Central West Orana, seeking to connect to existing transmission infrastructure. We envisage that access rights will also be offered and are likely to be limited to projects within Central West Orana, as the access scheme declaration for Central West Orana is intended to be in place at that time. An important thing to note is that projects connecting to existing transmission infrastructure in a declared RES that doesn't yet have an access scheme are also welcome to participate in that tender and will not be asked to pay access fees or require an access right later. This will allow us to get more projects committed sooner and fast track the development of new built energy. So to summarise the scenarios, if you're in the RES and connecting to existing infrastructure, you can bid for an LTESA now in that Q4 tender. If you're outside the RES connecting to existing infrastructure, you can also bid for an LTESA but must demonstrate outstanding merit. If you're in CWO RES and want to connect to the new infrastructure, you can bid now for an access right only or an access right and LTESA. If it's new infrastructure in a RES without a declared access scheme, we ask that you wait for the scheme declaration before participating in any tender. There are benefits to storage connecting in a RES, and declared access schemes will clarify how connections to new transmission will be allowed, but for CWO RES, storage will be eligible for access rights. That's my update. Thanks, Deb.
Great, thanks so much, Melanie. I'm now going to hand over to Brad Hopkins, who's the Co-General Manager of Commercial, and Graham Eady, who's the General Manager of Financial Markets and Operations. Thanks so much. Brad, I think you're starting off.
Thank you, Deb. Firstly, I wanted to thank everybody for the comprehensive feedback we received on our LTESA designs. And when I look back on where we started with the contract design and where we've got to, it really has been a co-development process with the market. So we've had a lot of very good feedback. which we've taken into consideration, and we'd like to talk you through some of the changes. It's also worth noting that we've had very contrasting feedback. So certain parts of the market had strong preferences around certain aspects of the Altezza design. Other parts of the market had almost opposing preferences around the structure of the Altezza. And so in putting together what we're going to take to tender, we have had to balance all of those different interests, and we've used both quantitative and qualitative assessment tools to figure out what is optimal for New South Wales electricity customers. What I will say finally before I pass on to my colleague Graham is that we came away from those discussions with the market with the impression that the Altezza is well understood as a tool, and importantly, the Altezza is not a CFD. It's not intended to be a swap. It's an option. And so it's intended as a form of insurance to support your project in the event of unexpectedly low electricity prices in the future. So we want to support the contracts market. We want PPAs to thrive, and we want to make sure that the Altezza is only used as a fallback. Now, with that in mind, I'll pass to Graham, who can talk to you about our analysis of the Altezza contractual shape.
Hi, thanks for that, Brad. So just on the contractual shape specifically, so we're doing an evaluation of default contractual shape, and that's continuing. And it's important to note, this is subject to consideration and decision by the AEMO Services Board. So the final decision is not quite ready yet. AEMO Services may permit proponents to bid against one or more of the 3 structures outlined in the draft term sheets, or some variation on these 3 structures. Where AEMO Services allows bidders to bid against multiple structures, the tender guidelines will outline how these will be compared and evaluated. So that's just a little bit about where we are on the contractual shape. So I'll hand back to you, Brad, around the close price.
Great, thanks, Graham. And we received some really interesting feedback on contractual shape. And as Graham said, we're working to figure out what shape will best suit the interests of New South Wales electricity customers in the long term. Now, one of the terms, or the 2 of the terms that we received almost universal feedback on were the financial close price adjustment and the upside sharing on disposal. And I think it's fair to say that the developer and investor community did not like these arrangements. And so at least for the first tender, we've elected to remove them. That's a decision that's not taken lightly, because we do ultimately think that those adjustments provide some protections for consumers against windfall gains that accrue to projects. But it's also important to note that the market and investors are digesting a lot of new information. And what we're trying to do is to simplify the first tender to allow people to adjust to that. And then we will look to, if it's appropriate, we'll look to reintroduce some of these features in future tenders. The third change that we've made is that we've got a 2-year option exercise period. So the Altezza is made up of 10 by 2-year options. So you can exercise an option every 2 years. That period was selected because it allowed projects to go out and seek short-term PPAs, and then to fall back on the Altezza in the event that they either couldn't get a PPA and they were uncomfortable taking merchant exposure during that period. So a 2-year option period. Some of the feedback we received indicated that an annual option period would be preferable. And we haven't been comfortable moving to an annual period yet, just because of the logistics involved around addressing annual option exercise. But we feel that once the systems for the scheme financial vehicle are in place, and once we know operationally we can deliver that, we see no barrier to eventually moving to annual option periods. So that's good news. The fourth one that we've had a huge amount of discussion with the market over, and thank you in particular the industry peak bodies who have contributed very constructively to the discussion on this point is around the long duration storage eligibility. So the statute that governs the roadmap is very clear that long duration storage must be able to operate at a registered capacity for 8 hours. So what that means is that you need to have had your project registered with AEMO at a capacity for which it can operate at 8 hours. Now, the challenge with doing this is that our modelling shows that 8-hour storage isn't needed in New South Wales at the moment. And so from a purist economic perspective, we acknowledge that that's a suboptimal outcome. So we will be paying for storage that isn't strictly needed. But we have looked at our options around optimising that, and our view is that the statute is clear on what it requires, and rather than look to have different interpretations of the statute, we would like to proceed with 8-hour eligibility requirement for long duration storage. Now, you won't have to operate the project for 8 hours. You won't have to retain storage for that period of time, but your storage project must have that registered capacity. The operating requirements around long duration storage haven't changed. So it's an availability requirement and a requirement to respond to market signals, but you're going to have full discretion over how the project operates. Moving on to number 5. So and it's a related point, we received lots of feedback from different groups about having a more prescriptive regime for how long duration storage should operate. So placing constraints on long duration storage so that you had to maintain a certain level of charge or you had to behave in a particular way. We have retained the position that we started with some nuances. Now, it does, as I said earlier, encourage as much flexibility for the projects as is possible. So the obligations on long duration storage projects are that they retain availability and maintain availability, and that they respond to market signals. So what that means is that if you are an infrastructure investor, you could sign a contract with a party. You could hand control of the battery of the storage project to that party, and that party could operate the battery as they see fit. So you've got a very broad range of potential contracting structures that opens up, and we haven't been restrictive at all on how that should operate. Lastly, we looked at the scope to restrict, we looked at categories of technologies, and we looked at different mixes of technologies, and we received submissions requesting that certain technologies be given a quota or an allocation. And what we eventually landed on was that we are applying the same standard across all technologies. So the statute and its requirements are that we act in the best interests of New South Wales electricity customers, and that means favouring the projects that deliver the best value to all of those to those electricity customers. So we're going to be looking for the best value projects, and in later discussions we'll talk about what that means in terms of assessment. So I might finish there and hand back to Deb. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks, Graham, for that. If we go to the next slide, please. We're going to head into our panel discussion with the panellists now. And we're going to be looking at these 3 areas with the questions that I'm going to be posing to the panellists. And Graham, maybe a question for you to start with. And Brad was really talking there about that LTESA should be considered as a different instrument to government CFDs. And they're really like a fallback or an insurance product. What do you think this is going to mean in general terms for the financing of projects?
Thanks, Deborah. The generation LTESA is actually an options contract, and it allows the holder to decide if the contract is to be exercised for a given period or not. So the holder has got the power to exercise or not. This means that rather than receiving a guaranteed revenue level for each unit of generation, holders will only exercise the option if it's favourable to do so. So in periods when high market prices are anticipated, it's less likely that holders will exercise, and as they can gain more revenue from the spot market. So that's a good thing. And conversely, in periods where low prices are anticipated, holders are more likely to exercise the option to protect against low spot market revenue. The optionality has value, and it's this value that ASL is expects to be reflected back in its bids that it receives. Simply put, this means that generation LTESAs should be bid at a level materially below traditional government CFDs and materially below the levelized cost of energy of the corresponding technology. So in relation to the financing of projects, our interactions with the market have noted the advantage of the generation LTESA is it allows holders to contract for shorter duration private sector PPAs when prices are high, and that can offer higher revenue for the project. And for debt financiers, see the LTESA as an instrument to help debt service coverage ratios to be met. And a combination of LTESA, potential short-term PPAs and spot market exposure is actually sufficient for project financing. So that's the advantages. Thanks, Deborah.
Great. Thanks so much, Graham. Baharak, I might go to a question for you now. So assuming that the access scheme declaration is in place by the tender, could someone apply for a LTESA and an access right for a project intending to connect to existing infrastructure in the Central West Orana RES?
Thank you, Deb. So I think as Melanie pointed out in her update, projects that are connecting to existing infrastructure do not require an access right. All projects connecting to existing infrastructure in or out of reses are eligible to apply for an LTESA, and we would encourage them to consider participating in the Q4 tender. So where projects apply to connect within a res to existing infrastructure, including CWO, they rely on the open access rules for their connection, and that including the requirements of the NERL and the NER, and the access scheme regime won't apply to them. Thanks, Deborah. That answered the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Baharak. And then another one I think would be good for you to have a look at is if an access scheme has not yet been declared in the RES, can my project connect to an existing network infrastructure in a RES and be eligible to bid for an LTESA?
Again, yes, the answer is yes. Projects within a RES that is being declared but doesn't yet have an access scheme, projects can apply for an LTESA or bid for an LTESA to connect to existing infrastructure. And again, as I said in my earlier question, the open access rules will apply. What we are intending to do to provide certainty, to improve certainty for projects, for proponents in thinking about submitting bids, the intent is that projects that are successful in obtaining an LTESA connecting to existing infrastructure, the intent is that future access schemes declared for that particular RES won't require those projects to pay access fees or undertake additional requirements to do with their connection. And that is a part of the encouragement for projects to not have to wait for an access scheme in particular RES. If you're connecting to an existing infrastructure within a declared RES, you can, and the open access rules will apply.
Great. Thanks, Baharak. Melanie, question for you that came through previously that I think be worthy to address in this forum. Someone was suggesting that they've got a 1,000 megawatt renewable energy project and that they're worried about how they can bid in the tender. It doesn't look like their project will fit within the indicative tender size. Is my project going to constrain me from being awarded an LTESA or an access right?
So no, it won't constrain the project. The tender size that we've set, and for Q4 2022, the size we've set is 2,500 gigawatt hours of annual generation. That's based on modelling, and so it's not going to be a hard constraint when it comes to our real world decision making. For the 1 gigawatt project that you've described, that potentially would exceed that 2,500 gigawatt hours per annum target, but that isn't necessarily going to be an issue if that project could demonstrate high value and is in the long-term interest of New South Wales consumers, then that project could theoretically be successful. If the project was connecting in CWO, then the access rights not limited by the tender size. So access rights can be granted in excess of the tender size, and in fact they're unrelated to the LTESA tender size. The total limit for access rights are set by the access scheme, and they'll be allocated across multiple tenders for CWO. So for that 1 gigawatt project, if it was applying within CWO, it could apply for access rights up to its capacity, assuming that there's enough allocation left at the tender that it participates in. And it can apply for LTESA up to its annual generation volume. For our first tender, if it was successful, obviously that may exceed the indicative target that we've set. So it's likely that project would need to score very well, as it would reduce the ability for other projects to be successful. And if in that first tender we end up getting a lot of high quality bids and large projects, and we materially exceed that indicative target, then that may mean we reduce the targets in the following tenders, but that would be communicated well in advance of those subsequent tenders. The other option for the 1 gigawatt project is, particularly if it's to be delivered in stages, that the proponent could apply for LTESAs and access rights if it's in CWO for each of the stages, which would reduce the capacity that it would be seeking to achieve. If the project is outside of CWO res, it's a little less complex, that the project can still apply for LTESAs up to its annual generation volume, but the project doesn't need to consider any constraints on access rights that may occur over time in that case.
Great. Thanks so much, Melanie. And thanks to Baharak, to Melanie, to Brad and to Graham for all of those questions. They've been fantastic, and thanks for the presentations as well. I'd now like to hand over to Thomas Urbert, who's the General Manager of Stakeholder Relations, who'll be talking through next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Well, first of all, thank you to my colleagues for that really constructive and informative session. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to watch and listen to this webinar, our first activity in the market briefing series. Our next briefing to the market will provide an update on contract structure and capturing value from generation and long duration storage LTESAs. We acknowledge that we're a new organisation delivering new products and services in a new way, and this means that our engagement with customers and prospective customers is critical to our success. Through our market briefing exercise more broadly, we're committed to maintaining an open and ongoing dialogue with all of our stakeholders, prospective customers, consumers, and others on how best we can fulfil our role within the New South Wales electricity roadmap. Our door is always open via our email, stakeholderengagement@aemoservices.com.au, and our new website, aemoservices.com.au, which will be continually updated with new information and updates, publications, the podcasts that Baharak referred to, and all our market briefing materials. We're particularly keen to hear from you to ensure that the information we're providing is appropriate to get you ready for the Q4 2022 tender and beyond. Thanks, Deb.
Great. Thanks so much, Thomas, and thank you everybody for joining us today.